start, warm ourselves up with the warm words of Jonah. All right, well, welcome everyone. Thanks for all braving the very fresh weather. It's absolutely freezing, so you've done very well. Particularly Jonah, who was on his deathbed last week. He's come out to brave tonight, so very, very strong man he is. And yeah, obviously we're going to finish up on Ecclesiastes, which is great. If you'll just remain seated, we'll just open up with a word of prayer to begin our night together. To our Father who dwells in heaven above, we come before you now so thankful for blessing us with yet another day, for keeping us safe today and for bringing us here together to open up your word and to learn from it. And as we do this, Heavenly Father, we pray that you would open up our hearts and minds unto you, that we might be moulded by it, that each of us here might do our best to bring glory before you. We also pray for those, Heavenly Father, that might be trying to find truth in this world at the minute. We see a world that's struggling, a world that's in turmoil. People are afraid, so we pray that they might turn to you in these last days. Above all, Heavenly Father, we ask for the soon return of your Son, and it's through him that we seek you now, through the Lord Jesus Christ, our coming King. So for this last study in Ecclesiastes, we're just going to read from Ecclesiastes chapter 7. Ecclesiastes chapter 7. A good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of one's birth. It is better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting, for that is the end of all men, and the living will lay it to his heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by the sadness of the countenance the heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. It is better to hear the rebuke of the wise than for a man to hear the song of fools. For as the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of the fool. This also is vanity. Surely oppression maketh a wise man mad, and a gift destroyeth the heart. Better is the end of a thing than the beginning thereof, and the patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. Be not hasty in thy spirit to be angry, for anger resteth in the bosom of fools. Say not thou, what is the cause that the former days were better than these? For thou dost not inquire wisely concerning this. Wisdom is good with an inheritance, and by it there is profit to them that see the sun. For wisdom is a defence, and money is a defence, but the excellency of knowledge is that wisdom giveth life to them that have it. Consider the work of God. For who can make that straight which he hath made crooked? In the day of prosperity be joyful, but in the day of adversity consider. God also hath set the one over against the other, to the end that man should find nothing after him. All things have I seen in the days of my vanity. There is a just man that perisheth in his righteousness, and there is a wicked man that prolongeth his life in his wickedness. Be not righteous over much, neither make thyself over wise. Why shouldest thou destroy thyself? Be not over much wicked, neither be thou foolish. Why shouldest thou die before thy time? It is good that thou shouldest take hold of this. Also from this withdraw not thine hand, for he that feareth God shall come forth of them all. Wisdom strengtheneth the wise more than 10 mighty men which are in the city. For there is not a just man upon earth that doeth good and sinneth not. Also take no heed unto all words that are spoken, lest thou hear thy servant curse thee. For oftentimes also thine own heart knoweth that thou thyself likewise hast cursed others. All this have I proved by wisdom. I said, I will be wise, but it was far from me. That which is far off and exceeding deep, who can find it out? I applied mine heart to know and to search and to seek out wisdom and the reason of things, and to know the wickedness of folly, even of foolishness and madness. And I find more bitter than death, the woman, whose heart is snares and nets, and her hands as bands. Whoso pleaseth God shall escape from her, but the sinner shall be taken by her. Behold, this have I found, saith the preacher, counting one by one to find out the account, which yet my soul seeketh, but I find not. One man among 1,000 have I found, but a woman among all those have I not found. Lo, this only have I found, that God hath made man upright, but they have sought out many inventions. And I'll hand over to John now.
I don't know whether I did put my pointer. It wasn't back there, was it, Richard? I'll just use my mouse, that's fine. Well, good evening, everyone. And as Tom has said, thank you very much for coming out on this cold evening. What a shock of reality for people like Mason and Jerusha as they've settled into Melbourne, and also Paul and Heather as they've returned from sunny Europe, to be welcomed this week by, I think it was 8 today, 9. Beautiful. 6. Even better. But tonight we're going to continue our look at this book of Ecclesiastes, and tonight in particular we're going to have a look at this subject of wisdom. As I said from the start, unfortunately we're not going to be able to get through the whole of the book of Ecclesiastes, so we're just trying to take some snippets from Solomon's wise words. Now, this evening we're going to take, this section comes from chapter 7 through to chapter 10 of Ecclesiastes. Solomon focuses on this subject of wisdom, and he recommends the pursuit of wisdom as something that all of us should pursue in our lives for our benefits. Now, it's interesting or helpful just when we start the book of Ecclesiastes to look at this subject of wisdom. It's important to note that Solomon talks about 2 different types of wisdom in the book of Ecclesiastes. He's already looked at one type, and that is secular wisdom or human wisdom. And he looked at the pursuit of that in chapters 1 and chapter 2. And he looked at all the ways that he could be wise. And he did that by experience. He experienced all these things and collected all these wise things that he could do. And his conclusion to that in many ways was he became frustrated by it. And he said, the more I found that I gained wisdom and experience and got all this knowledge, the more depressed I became about what was the end of life. So he found that human wisdom and experience ultimately is not the answer. Of course, the other thing about human wisdom to note is that human wisdom, which we can all gain by experience in life, by doing things and then thinking, oh, I'm not going to do that again, I'm going to do that better, it's prone to being flawed because we can gain experience from life that could be wrong. And I guess the perfect example of that is the serpent in the garden, who, from his own experience, looked around and made an error of judgment. And I guess that expresses the limitation of human wisdom. But the wisdom that Solomon talks about in chapter 7 to 10 is divine wisdom. And divine wisdom is trusting in what God's word and his recommendations have for us in life, and then endeavouring to live by them. That's the wisdom that Solomon recommends in chapter 7 to 10. Now, that is something that we're all never going to be able to do perfectly, but Solomon recommends wisdom of this type to anyone in life. You should pursue after godly wisdom. It's a great benefit for you in life. And he talks about the value of this type of wisdom in that reading that we had in chapter 7 and verse 11. This is what he says wisdom is like. He says, wisdom is good with an inheritance. It is an advantage to those who see the sun. So those who are in the world, this human condition, under the sun like we all are, he says wisdom is good like an inheritance. In fact, I'll read it from another translation which makes it a little bit clearer. The New English translation says this: wisdom, like an inheritance, is a good thing. It benefits those who see the light of day. So Solomon likens the pursuit of wisdom like an inheritance. Now, when you think about an inheritance in many ways is a good thing, isn't it? Like, it's sad because when you're getting an inheritance, someone is passing away and passing it to you. But what an inheritance can do, and what they hope it's going to do when a parent passes that to a child, is that that child might receive something that will give them a helping hand, a real head start in life, because they might have not been able to buy a house or set up for life, and all of a sudden an inheritance comes, and an inheritance provides the person with security and direction and purpose in life, because it's been passed down from a parent to a child. Now, Solomon says, that's what I've found the benefit of wisdom to be like. It's something that can actually set you up for your entire life, if you listen to it and are very careful with it in the wisdom that God provides. It's a wonderful thing. In fact, he says there, it's an advantage to those who see the sun. Now, the interesting thing about that word is that word advantage, in some of your translations, I think in the AV, it's the word profit. And you might remember we mentioned earlier on in our studies that one of the things Solomon is trying to do is he's trying to find what profit there is in life at the end of it, when it's all finished. What can I have? And Solomon said, I found that in wisdom, godly wisdom, there was something of profit. There was something of advantage that I could gain from life. So very worthwhile looking at. And what the advantage is, he describes in verse 12. Or some of the advantage. He says, for the protection of wisdom is like the protection of money. So he says, wisdom, what I found, is it provides you with protection in life, in the same way that a fortune might provide protection for a rich man. He said, I found that wisdom provided protection. All the little bits of wisdom that God gives us, if we use them in our life, they can actually protect us from things. Now, we've got to put a caveat there, because what we've also discovered from the book of Ecclesiastes is Solomon says there's no guarantees. There's always going to be things that happen in life that are outside your control. But as a whole, what I found was wisdom provides protection in life. Now, that's true, isn't it? When you just even think about when you read the Proverbs and all the bits of wisdom that Solomon gave in all those verses, all the little things that you can do in your life and apply in your life. And some of us, I'm sure, have already applied some of those things and seen the wisdom and the truth of those words of Solomon, that they do, in fact, provide protection for us. They're an advantage. And that's what Solomon said. And then finally, he said this at the end of verse 12, and the advantage of knowledge, or the excellency of knowledge, as I think the AV says, is that wisdom preserves the life of him that has it. So he says, the other thing I've found about wisdom, and probably the most valuable thing about wisdom, is he says it has the ability to preserve life. Now that's true from a standpoint of just this life now. Following God's wisdom provides the best possible life now. But it's also, and most importantly, it points us to the life of the future. And that's where its true value is. It talks about the ultimate life, which is the life of the future. So all those things, Solomon says, are the value or benefit of having wisdom. Now, what we want to do tonight is just look at 8 different traits of wisdom very quickly, taken from these verses from these chapters, chapter 7 through to chapter 10, to build up some of these ideas of the traits of people who are wise. And I found a lot of these to be really helpful. Things that you can apply to your life immediately, that are so helpful in the way that you can live your life. This is what Solomon said are some of the traits of the wise. So, firstly, the wise are reflective. And we find that in verse 2 and 3 of Ecclesiastes. Sorry, I'll actually read verse 3 and 4, and I'll read these for you. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by sadness of face, the heart is made glad. The heart of the wise is in the house of the mourning, but the heart of the fools is in the house of mirth. So one of the things Solomon found about those who are wise is he says they seek out moments of reflection, and in particular in these verses, and we did touch on these in one of our previous classes, that they go to moments and use moments of sadness in life for their advantage. Now, what Solomon is not saying is that what I found was that people who are wise are just very morbid people who like to hang around at funerals and really sad sort of occasions, because that would be pretty depressive, wouldn't it, if that's what he was recommending us? Because we know that Solomon has on many other occasions recommended joy and laughter and all those different things, the joys of life. He's recommended that to us. But when he comes to moments of reflection, moments in life that can actually be moments of real change, and he talks about that, doesn't he? He says, by going to the house of mourning, I noticed that it was an opportunity for the heart to learn. And so it's an important thing to do. And all of us, I'm sure, have been to a funeral. And they're sometimes very sad occasions because they're someones that we've really loved. But I actually quite enjoy, as hard as that is, particularly going to Christadelphian weddings, particularly those who have lived a long and full life and there's not a tragedy associated with it. There's an amazing learning opportunity in those moments. There's just in the last 12 months, we've had unfortunately, lots of occasions like that in Melbourne of older brothers and sisters who have passed away, who you go and you're able to, in a snapshot, see their entire life. And I guess that's the thing that Solomon's saying, isn't he? Even though you're going to a funeral which is about death, what you learn is about life. And that's why there's so much benefit to it. Because you can contemplate what's important in life. And Solomon said, that's a really important thing that I found the wise would make sure they made time for. Key moments of reflection in moments of sadness. That's something that we can all do as the wise. The next trait of the wise is they are open to correction. And we find this in verse 5 of chapter 7. He says, "It is better for a man to hear the rebuke of wise than to hear the song of fools." So Solomon said, one of the things I noticed about the wise was that they were prepared to be corrected. They were prepared to take advice and rebuke. Now that is one of the hardest things to do in life, because none of us like to be told off or to have our ego bruised, particularly by someone else who comes up and wants to tell us about it. But Solomon said, if you can take that in life, that will do you enormous benefit. In fact, he expands a little bit on it in Proverbs chapter 9 when he talks about this same theme of being rebuked. And I think there's some important points in this verse that tell us why it's actually valuable. Do not reprove a mocker, or he will hate you. Reprove a wise person. So there's a trait amongst the wise who's prepared to accept someone to come up and correct them for a start. And that person will love you. They might not love you immediately as you're telling them about your problem, but eventually they will. Give instruction to a wise person and he will become wiser still. Teach a righteous person and he will add to his learning. So the thing Solomon says about someone who's prepared to take rebuke is not that they're just like a tough sort of person and you can tell me whatever you want. What he's calling out here is the ability to grow. to develop your character. That is a trait of the wise. They are prepared to grow. And that's what life is all about. Solomon's already talked about that. He's already talked about that when he talked about the subject of time. And he said one of the things why God has put all the different types of time in our life is so that our characters will be developed over time through all the different ups and downs of life. So growth in character is a trait that the wise take on board. And Solomon said, I really recommend this to you. And the inverse of that, which he doesn't recommend, is to hear the song of fools. It's easy to hear the song of fools, isn't it? When someone tells you what you want to hear or what you are, but so tells you the good things about you, but it's never prepared to tell you the bad things about you. But Solomon goes on to say, that's just like the crackling of thorns in a pot. That's just like, when you put like a tree on the fire that burns really quickly and it goes quickly and then it's gone. There's no long-term benefit to that. So Solomon says the wise will seek out long-term benefit, particularly for the development of their character. Now, the other thing you'll note, if you read that verse carefully, is the wise are not just prepared to take rebuke, they're also prepared to give it. Look at verse 5 says again, better is a man to hear the rebuke of the wise. So a wise person is also prepared to give rebuke to other people. I wonder if you're prepared to give rebuke to someone else. That's hard, isn't it? To actually take the time to actually take someone under your wing and care enough for them to highlight something that they could do better. Solomon says, I also found that to be a trait of the wise, right? They're prepared to give rebuke and they're prepared to take rebuke. A very important thing that Solomon says is important in life. Okay, the other thing that they're prepared to do is they're prepared to develop endurance. And we find this down in verse 8. This is what he says in verse 8 about endurance or patience. Better is the end of a thing than its beginning, and the patient in spirit better than the proud in spirit. So he says, better I found to be the end of the thing than the beginning of a thing. Now that seems a bit weird, doesn't it? Because shouldn't it be the other way around? Like I always look forward to the start of a holiday or the start of life or the start of something rather than the end of it. Why does Solomon say it's better the end of the thing than the start of the thing? Well, I think what Solomon's saying here is it's easy to start stuff. It's easy to go, right, I'm going to change my life this year. I'm going to do something different starting this week tomorrow. It's easy to make all those types of statements. But he said the wise I found to be people who could end something, to push through, to be patient enough to set something or to push right through to the end of something. Now that could be personally that you're trying to do in developing your character. It could be something from the Ecclesia point of view. Anything like that. Solomon says it's better to get to the end of something, right? And that requires, as he then goes on to say, better is the patient in spirit than the proud in spirit. So I found the person who's prepared to be careful and to be patient and to work through things is much wiser than someone who's proud and hasty and just wants to get it done quickly. And I found that to be the case, Solomon said, when I was looking at anything that someone tasks themselves with, and also when it came to someone weighing up judgment of something. It's better to hear all the facts and to weigh those things up and be patient until the end. Solomon said, I found that to be a trait of the wise. They develop endurance, and all of us can develop that in our life. The other thing that he found the wise to do is the wise don't live in the past. And he talks about this in verse 10. He says, say not, why were the former days better than these? For it is not from wisdom from which you ask this thing. So Solomon says, one of the traits that's important about the wise is they don't always live in the past. Now, the problem for that, I find, is that the older you get, the more tempting it is to want to be like that. It's just so tempting. And so people are like, oh, the older they get, oh, well, we remember what it was like back in the 50s. You know, it was so much better, the things that we used to do. And it could be society, right? It could be the ecclesia, the way things were. And often what we're doing is we're looking back with rose-coloured glasses, like imagining things to be what they actually weren't, right? And then each generation does the same thing. Like that, people were saying about the 50s, then it was the 60s, my mum and dad going about the 70s. I'm starting to talk about the 80s and 90s as if they were the greatest times ever, right? They actually weren't, right? It was bad fashion. It was no good whatsoever. But Solomon said this temptation to want to look back into the past and imagine it was better than what it was. He said, don't fall into the trap of doing that. You can learn from the past and grow from the past, but Solomon says, always keep your focus on the future, building for the future. And isn't that a great thing to have your mindset to focus upon that? Learn from the past, but leave the past behind. You can't change the past. And it was never as good as what you thought. I remember we were talking about the June weekend, just this last June weekend, thinking, oh, wasn't the June weekend great and stuff? And then we're thinking, me and Claire were going, oh, I remember the old June weekends, what the June weekends was like. And I found a video from like 20 years ago in this hall of like the great past June weekends. And it was just like, it looked so boring, right? There was hardly any people there, right? It was much better what we actually had. So that's what Solomon says. Focus on the future. And isn't that an important thing to do in your own life? And isn't that an important thing for us to do as an ecclesia? Things have happened in the past. We can't change those things. Things may have been better. Maybe it was true. We can't go back there. Let's focus on the future. How can we build for the future and learn from the past? Solomon says that's what wise people do. They look to the future. Don't live in the past. That's not what wise people do. The other thing that the wise do, he found, and I find this one really interesting, is they avoid extremes. Look what he says here in chapter 7, and this one's a little bit longer than the others. He talks about this idea of extremes, extreme behaviour that people can go to in life. Verse 15, he says this, "In my vain life I have seen everything. There is a righteous man who perishes in his righteousness, and there is a wicked man who prolongs his life in his evil doing." So Solomon said, and we've already thought about this, he said, what I observed about life is it's not just. In fact, sometimes it's there's downright injustice about it. And he said, I've seen really good righteous people get treated completely terribly, and there's no retribution for it. Yet I've seen other people, wicked people, who just do the most wicked things in their entire life, and they get away with all of it, and they're praised, and then they die. And it just seems so unjust. Now, what Solomon said, though, as a result of that, he says, as a result of that injustice, people are frustrated by that. Now, it is a frustrating thing, and people in the Bible have been frustrated by that. Like people in the Psalms, like Asaph, very famous Psalm 73, where he's like, you know what, I actually almost slipped, I almost left the truth. He's like a righteous man, one of the most faithful men in the whole of Israel, like the musicians in all Israel. But he said, I actually almost slipped and left the truth because I just got so frustrated with the people who are wicked, who seem to get away with whatever they want and live the greatest lives, and other people who are really trying hard have it really bad. I almost left the truth over that. And there's other people like David and others in the Psalms who are frustrated by the same thing. And Solomon said, what I noticed is sometimes people, to try and equalise that somehow, they went to two different extremes of behaviour. And he talks about the two extremes. Firstly, in verse 16, he says, "Be not therefore overly righteous, and do not make yourself too wise." So what Solomon noticed was that some people, in attempting to sort of deal with this injustice in the world or in life, became super righteous, or tried to become super righteous to overcome this anomaly in life. So they were so strict with everything they did in life to try and control their lives completely. And I suppose the perfect example of that is the Jews and the Pharisees and those types of people who lived life, and they tried to control everything they did and look perfect to everyone else in what was going around to try and control their lives completely. But Solomon said, what I found was that was not the answer to life. Because of this, why should you destroy yourself? Yeah, so he says, why should you destroy yourself? And the reason why he says that is because that's where that type of behaviour leads. Because no one can be perfectly righteous. In fact, he says that down in verse 20. He says, surely there is not a righteous man on the earth who does good and never sins. You will never be able to become perfectly righteous. And so if you go down this path of trying to be super righteous in front of all the rest of the people, you're only going to burn yourself out, and obviously also be susceptible to self-righteousness and pride. So he said that is not the answer. But then he said on the flip side of that, I saw people go the other extreme. And this is what also happens in life, doesn't it? Verse 17, he says, be not therefore overly wicked, neither be a fool. So he said, I saw other people, and their response was, I'm just going to live a life exactly as I want. I couldn't care less about anyone else. I'm going to live to extreme and do whatever sinful thing I want and just live to abandon. He said, I saw some people do that. But Solomon says that's not the answer either. Be not overly wicked, neither be a fool. Why should you die before your time? Solomon said that's not the answer. That I saw just lead to pain and ultimately regret for those people for some of the things that they had done. So Solomon observed that people sometimes lived these two different extreme type lifestyles. Now he says it's important to learn from both of those. Verse 18, he says, it is good that you should not take hold of this, and from that withhold not your hand. So he says you need to learn from both of those extremes that they are not the answer. But what he's not saying here, and it seems like he is when you read these verses, that the answer is don't be too righteous, don't be too wicked, just sort of take a little bit of wickedness, take a little bit of righteousness, and sort of that'll be the perfect balance for you in life. That's not what he's saying. He then gives the answer to how to have a balanced life. And I found this important to think about. This is what he says at the end of verse 18. He says, it is good that you should take hold of this, and from that withhold not your hand. In other words, learn from those two extremes. For the one who fears God shall come out from both of them. Solomon says the answer to a balanced character and life is the fear of God. Making sure that God is always central to what you do. That is the path of wisdom. Focusing upon God and fearing him. Now, if you do that, you'll avoid both of those extremes. The fear of God, because firstly, the fear of God reminds us that we are flawed, that he is righteous and perfect, and we are not. And that ultimately leads us to humility. And on the flip side, the fear of God also recognises that he sees everything that we do. He understands all the activities that we do in life, and that he will come in the end to bring us account to those things. And when we think about that, it brings us to reverence and a sense of responsibility. Because the focus is upon God. You think about those two extremes. The first extreme, the righteous person who's focused on being completely righteous, who's he thinking about? He's thinking about what other people think of him. It's all about what other people think of me. And what's the person who's like, I'll do whatever I want. I can just behave exactly how I want. What's he focusing on? He's focusing on himself and no one else. And Solomon said, if you want to be wise and know how to have a balanced character, you focus on God. And God, if he's your focus, that will result in a balanced character. It will avoid legalism on one hand, and it will avoid lawlessness on the other hand, because God is central. Now, I found that really helpful to think about. That's a helpful in ecclesial life, because in ecclesial life we can go to different extremes within the ecclesia. And sometimes those extremes that we can go to as a result of not focusing upon God. What does God want me to do? What does God think about this situation? And Solomon said, if we focus on the fear of God, that results in a balanced character that's going to avoid those two extremes. That, Solomon says, is the path of wisdom and very worthwhile to follow. The next thing he says is the wise respect authority, right? And he talks about this in chapter 8. Look what he says in chapter 8 and verse 2 to 5. And we talked about this a little bit actually a few weeks ago when Luke Parry was doing the talks about our responsibility to the state and conscientious objection. And Solomon talks a little bit about this here in Ecclesiastes. Verse 2, he says this, I say, keep the king's command. So this is what the wise do in relation to the authority or the government in which they live. Keep the king's command because of God's oath to him. So he says, my recommendation to you as a wise person is to keep the rules of the king. And he says the reason you should do that is not because the king's wise or that the king's got a great set of rules necessarily, but because of God's oath to him. Now, we thought about that, didn't we, when we looked at Romans chapter 13, verse 1, a couple of weeks ago with Luke. This is why we follow the authorities and the governments in which we live by. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except by God's appointment, and the authorities that exist have been instituted by God. God has appointed the rulership in the world in which we live and the governments in which we live. And so Solomon, like Paul, says we should respect that authority. Now he goes on to say, even though sometimes what they say is ridiculous and gets you so angry. Look what he says in verse 3. Be not hasty to go from his presence. Do not take your stand in an evil cause, for he does whatever he pleases. For the word of the king is supreme, and who may say to him, what are you doing? So he says, look, sometimes that might be frustrating because the king is totally unjust, or the rules that he's making don't make sense, or he's just putting speeding fines there so that he can make money off you. And it's so frustrating. But Solomon's recommendation is you can't beat the system. He's in charge. I've put him in charge. So how should you deal with him? Verse 5, whoever keeps a command will know no evil thing, and the wise heart will know the proper time and the just way. So he says, you're better to just abide by the law. If you do the right thing, what he says, you won't get in trouble. Now that has been for me a long and hard road and lesson to learn. And I feel that I have funded most of the new road projects that are going on in Victoria over the last 10 to 15 years in this state. And it has taken me a long time to learn the lesson that you're wasting your time. You're better to just respect. That's what he says. Even when it's unjust, show respect for the law in which God has instituted. And when you don't do that, you don't respect. Now, he did say there may be, in that verse, there may be a proper time and a just way in which you can bring your case to him at some point. And there may be a point in which you can do that. And Luke talked about that, how we've got the opportunity when we don't vote to bring our cause to God, to the authorities, and say this is why we don't actually do that. But he says, do it in the proper time. Do it with respect. Respecting authority doesn't mean condoning the behaviour of that particular authority. It acknowledges God's order and trusts his timing and his justice. I think that's a great, wise thing that Solomon outlines that we should do. And I thought about it. I thought there's actually a lot of examples in the Bible of people, men and women, who did that. People who were in positions of authority. I love to think about Daniel. You think about the way Daniel behaved himself in front of Nebuchadnezzar and all those other kings. He knew most of the time those kings were just out of control. But how does he behave himself? Always with respect. Always with respect and honour. Even though Nebuchadnezzar's going nuts sometimes. Because he was a man of wisdom who understood that God was in charge of the kingdoms of men and he rules over those things. And I think that's a challenging thing in the world that we live in. It is so tempting, and I put my hand up first to say I get tempted and dragged into this. It's so tempting to be dragged into all the political talk of the day and take sides on all the different characters that exist in the world today and what's going on, and I'm for this guy or that person. But Solomon says the wise, they actually live above that. And they respect all of the things that God has put in place, sometimes as absurd as they look. That's what the wise do. And they trust only in God and his judgments. That's what Solomon says the wise do. And that's a very important trait to take home with us. Okay, what's the next one? The wise recognise human limitation. Look at this in verse 16 of chapter 8. Solomon says, "When I applied my heart to know wisdom and to see the business that is done on earth, how neither day nor night do one's eyes sleep, then I saw all the work of God, that man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun, however much man toil." So Solomon says, look, I want you to understand that I put everything into trying to find out and discover the secret of life. In fact, I stayed up days and nights to try and find the secret key that could somehow unlock all of the anomalies of life and all of the seemingly injustice things that happen in life. And Solomon says, you know what my conclusion was? He says, "Then I saw all the work of God, that man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun." Solomon's conclusion was, there are things that we'll never be able to answer in life, even the righteous, about why things happen, about why things happen to you, or why things happen to me. I found that there's just a limit, that God's placed a limit upon human understanding. And he says, even though a wise man claims to know, he cannot find out. So he said, look, I found that some people said, actually, I know what the secret to life is. And if you follow this particular recipe, right, or you drink this particular milk, soy milk, sorry, not soy milk, that's 10 years ago, oat milk or almond, right? That, or this particular diet, or you follow this particular type of meditation. And the world's full of it, isn't it? All these wise people, and they're always writing books or writing podcasts or releasing YouTube videos about the secret to life. And Solomon says, I found the same people were in my day as well. Some people are saying, I've found the answer to it. If you just sit in this particular position at this time of the year and eat only kale, then everything will become clear. And people have got every single combination of that type of thinking under the sun out there. Look at some of them. The mountain is you. Right? Of course it is, okay? Finding your Walden. Have you found your Walden yet? If you haven't, you've never ever lived. Make your bed, right? The power of life of mastery. Meditation, wellness is the latest thing, isn't it? All these different things. Solomon says, trust me, you'll never find it. There's no secret ingredient. There is no secret ingredient to life. There are things that we will not understand. And it's the wise to come to that conclusion and accept that. Now, he gives some explanation then in the next 2 verses of chapter 9 that we can take from this. He says, "But all this I laid to heart, examining it all." So I thought about this and what conclusion I could take away from the fact that there's human limitation. And this is what he did take away. He says, how the righteous and the wise and their deeds are in the hands of God. So he said, look, even though there are limits to our understanding, what I did find is that the wise, those who are wanting to try and follow God, God has them in his hand. So we don't have to worry, even though we don't know, because God's got us in his hand. Because he says, their deeds and the wise and their deeds are in the hand of God, whether it is love or hate, man does not know, both are before him. So he says, you don't know what's in front of you, but you can trust that the wise are in the hands of God. And see, God's done that in his wisdom, hasn't he? You imagine, would you like to know all the details about what's ahead for you and your family in the next 10 years? It's interesting to think about, isn't it? And I think when you think about that, one of the things that you can help make that decision is, if you went back 10 years ago, would you like to have known all the details of the last 10 years in one go? Do you think you could have handled that in one moment? I think the answer for me definitely is I'd rather not know, actually. And see, God in his wisdom has done that. He doesn't tell us what's ahead because he doesn't want to crush us, right? He wants us to develop our character over that time. And he does that in his wisdom through all the ups and downs of life. As Solomon says, all the love and hate, all the things that will be before us. God has deliberately, in his love and mercy, preserved those things from our knowledge so that we don't know. And yet what we can do in moving forward is, as he also said in Proverbs, in all our ways acknowledge him, and he will direct our paths. That's what we need to come to. That the wise are in the hands of God. And if I acknowledge him in all my ways, regardless of what those ways might be, will he direct my paths? Of course he will, because that's why he's here. So Solomon said, whilst there's a limit to human understanding, there's a reason for that. And the wise understand that, and they accept that. The final one is, they put wisdom then into action. That's what the wise do. If you just look over at chapter 10 and verse 10, this is what he says about putting wisdom into action. He says, if the iron is blunt and one does not sharpen the edge, he must use more strength. But wisdom helps one succeed, or as mine says in the margin, wisdom is an advantage to those who to succeed. So he says, I liken wisdom to the sharpening of an axe or a knife. You know, if you've ever tried to cut wood, right? I'm often doing this because I'm never sharpening my axe, but it's just you just have to put so much more effort into cutting wood when you've got a blunt axe or a blunt knife. Like, you can't even cut through a tomato sometimes, right? With your knife that's blunt. But when you've got a freshly sharpened knife, it's just like a joy, isn't it, to cut things, right? When I'm in the kitchen, you know, right, preparing another meal for the family, right, and I've just sharpened all my equipment, right, there's nothing quite like it. And that's what Solomon said wisdom is like. Wisdom is an advantage to your success if you apply it in your life. But he then gives the next warning in verse 11. He says, if the serpent bites before it's charmed, there is no advantage to the charmer. So he gives this warning. He says, look, wisdom is a great advantage to you if you use it. But he says, don't be like a charmer who, what does a charmer do? A charmer is one of those snake charmers, right? Back in the, well, they're probably still there, right, in Egypt and stuff. And they take ages to learn the wisdom of, I assume they do, right? It doesn't come quickly. Learn the wisdom to charm the snake, right? And he's put all this time into it, like developing all this wisdom his whole entire life. And someone comes to have a look at his show and he's not concentrating, and all of a sudden the snake bites him and he's dead. What advantage was all of the preparation, all of the learning of the wisdom to charm the snake if he never used it? And Solomon says that's an important thing to think about too. The wisdom that we get must be put into practice. You must apply it for it to have its advantage. And he talks about this idea of action again in Ecclesiastes chapter 11 when he says this: he who observes the wind will not sow, and he who regards the clouds will not reap. So he says, he's talking about a farmer here, and he says, look, sometimes we can get to the point where we're waiting for the perfect conditions to apply these principles. They'll never come. Just like the man who looks for the perfect conditions to sow his seed, and they never ever come. Don't be like that, Solomon says. Be men and women of action. Use God's wisdom and the things that we've learned. We've all learnt so much stuff growing up in Sunday school and the meeting. Put them into practice in the way that you live your life every single day. Go over the top with it. Look what he says in the next verse. In the morning sow your seed. In the evening withhold not your hand. For you do not know which will prosper, this or that, or whether both alike will be for good. Throw your seed as much as you can in every single direction. Use all of the wisdom that you have gained that God has given to you. So the wise, Solomon says finally, are people of action. They apply it to the way they live, and in the meeting and at work, any way they possibly can, they apply wisdom. So that's some of the traits of wisdom. Now, let's just go back to chapter 8 and see what the result of wisdom then is. This is what Solomon said will be the result if you apply this to your life. Verse 1 of chapter 8 says this: who is like the wise, and who knows the interpretation of the thing? So Solomon says, you know what I found? There was no one like the wise. You should apply yourself to wisdom because there's nothing like it. You should absolutely apply yourself to know wisdom. It's the best thing that you can do in life. And this is what he says it will be like. Verse 2. A man's wisdom makes his face shine. So those who apply wisdom in their life, he says, their face will shine. And I guess shine is like a light. It gives direction for you. That's what wisdom will do in your life. It will give you direction. And all of us know that to be true, isn't it? What would we do? Where would we be without the wisdom and direction of God in our life? Where would you be if you didn't have the principles of God in your life? I don't know where I'd be. They provide so much direction for us, don't they? About how we should live, about the type of life we should live, about how to raise our family. All those things come from God's wisdom. And they make a man's face to shine because he knows where he's going. That's what he says wisdom will bring you. And he says this is what it will also bring you. And the hardness of his face is changed. The other thing that wisdom will do for you is the harshness of our face will change. And what he means by that is wisdom also develops in us humility and mercy, because we realise what we're like and what we're not like. And that brings humility. And that brings love and understanding of others. And isn't that the whole purpose of why we're here? To actually develop that and then to share that in the lives of others. All of that can come from wisdom, Solomon said, that I noticed. It's a worthwhile pursuit. Now, that's our final point for tonight about wisdom. Solomon says, get wisdom. It's so valuable. Listen and heed God's advice. It has benefits now and for the future. That's how valuable wisdom is. But one thing we'll then leave us with is and I think Solomon was frustrated with this as well, if wisdom is so valuable like that, why is it that more people are not drawn to it, just in life? Why aren't more people drawn to God's wisdom? Because we've seen some of the benefits of it that it can bring to your life. Why aren't people drawn to wisdom? Well, Solomon, and we'll just finish here in chapter 9, the end of chapter 9, he finishes this subject of wisdom by just telling this little parable about this exact subject. And in it, there's an important lesson for us to think about in our pursuit of wisdom. He tells this little parable about a king and a city and a wise man. And he's talking about, why don't people listen more to wisdom? Verse 13 says of chapter 9, I have also seen this example of wisdom under the sun, and it seemed great to me. It's like, you know what, when I thought about this, and whether this little story happened in real life, or whether it was just a story that became famous at the time, he said, when I thought about this, you know what, it really struck me. I just thought, man, it's so dumb. I was really taken aback by this. And this is what he says. There was a little city with a few men in it, and there was a great king that came against it and besieged it, building great siege works against it. But there was found in it a poor wise man, and he, by his wisdom, delivered the city. Yet, no one remembered the poor man. So Solomon says, he tells this story about this city, this great city that was probably on a hill, and it got sieged by a great king that came along with a huge army, and there was no way out for this city, and the whole city was sieged all around. There was no possible way that the city was going to be saved from this evil king. And yet inside that city, there was a wise man, and he was poor, so he was a man of renown, and he had the secret to saving that city. And he did. He saved it. And the whole city celebrated because the city was saved from this terrible king who had come. But Solomon said, you know what? No one remembered that wise man and what he had said and what he had done. Now, why was that the case? Well, the lesson that Solomon is trying to bring out of this little story is the world doesn't pay attention to the poor and the humble. And that little story proved my point. And so Solomon says to all of us, don't expect the world to value or listen to God's wisdom, even though it's good. And you know, he says that. He goes on to say that. He says, but there was found in that city a poor wise man, and he by his wisdom delivered the city, yet no one remembered the poor man. But I say that wisdom is better than might. Though the poor man's wisdom is despised, his words are not heard. So even though people aren't prepared to listen to God's wisdom, doesn't take away from the fact that they're brilliant. It's just that man can't see it. And why can't he see it? Look at the next verse he says, verse 17. Because the words of the wise are heard in quiet, and they are better than the shouting of ruler among fools. Who does our world want to listen to? Who's the voices that we hear every single day yelling and screaming at us? It's the rich and the proud and the powerful. They're screaming out at us every day on our phones and our screens, aren't they? That's the wisdom that the world wants to hear about all the time. And yet the words of the wise, they're quiet. Where are they? And you know, in that story, beautifully is that story, the poor man was Christ, wasn't he? The poor, humble man who came and saved the city. And how many people remember him? How many people care about what he said? Solomon says, that's where wisdom is found. Wisdom, he says, is better than weapons of war, and by one sinner destroys much good. And there's our challenge with wisdom. If you want wisdom, you need to carefully go and listen for it. Because you won't hear it shouting from the speakers of the world. You'll hear it quietly in the wilderness where it's always been heard. And all of us, brothers and sisters, if we want to continue to seek wisdom, and we do, don't we? We've got to go to where wisdom is heard. We have got to somehow in life carve out moments of time to think about God's wisdom and then to apply it in action in the way that we live our life. And Solomon said, if you do that, it's such a great pursuit, something very worthwhile to be wise. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Jono. Not only for tonight's class, but for the past two as well in Ecclesiastes. And just for me to sum up, just some thoughts, which is actually up on the screen, just the non-negotiable need for us to get wisdom, which is from Proverbs chapter 4, verse 5, where Solomon says, "Get wisdom, get understanding. Forget it not, neither decline from the words of my mouth. Forsake her not, and she shall preserve thee. Love her, and she shall keep thee. Wisdom is the principal thing, therefore get wisdom." If you all just like to stand, we'll just get Dan to close in prayer.
Great God in heaven, we lift our voices at the conclusion of our class to you in praise. You are a great and a wise God, and we are thankful for this evening we've been able to come aside in quietness and just to listen to your words of wisdom through your wise servant Solomon. We thank you for these wonderful lessons, and we've been impressed again this evening by the wisdom of your word, and we pray that you would help us to take those lessons into our lives and to live lives that are seeking wisdom. Help us to look to you, dear Father, for that wisdom, and to your word, which is able to make us wise unto salvation. So we thank you also for the time we'll share together now in fellowship and enjoying good company, and also we are thankful for the food and the drink that you have blessed us with. Please care for us as we travel home this night. We long most of all for your kingdom to be established on this earth, when all man will come to a knowledge and an understanding of who you are and of your wonderful and wise plan for this earth. So we thank you and we long for this time through our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen.